One thing is that although lots and lots of individuals are very, very creative, in my experience, the creative juices get running because you talk to somebody else about your idea and they criticize it. And then you get angry about that and you have this great argument. And in the end, you end up with something even better. I don't know if that's your experience.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Yeah, I fully agree with you. I believe, as Giovanni said this morning, there are some natural-born inventors. But even for these people, they need to be connected to other people to get more creative. I like this quote from Steve Jobs, you know, creativity, it's about connecting dots, different dots. But our people in our industry don't have enough dots. So you have to meet other people to get more dots and to connect every dot and get the big picture. I think it's how creativity works, I believe.
I realize we get to shut each other off because if you push this thing, you cut the other guy. This is great. So I'm just waiting for you to tell me you need more quantum dots to be interconnected. Just one other observation. When Bob Kahn and I were working together, every once in a while we would get into these really heated arguments. And after a while, we realized that there was a reason for that. Usually it was because each of us had a very different model in our heads about what it was we were talking about. And we would discover the argument was because each of us was reasoning from a very different model. And so whatever the other person said was crazy. And so we learned very quickly that if we started to get into a heated argument, we would stop and say, okay, hang on, let's find out whether we have different models, and then resolve the models, and then have the argument over the same model instead of a different one.
So now I've got a question for you. Do you think that just bringing people together is enough?
No. No. And I think part of the reason for that is that there are other ingredients in the creativity recipe besides just people. So here's a couple of things. One of them is freedom. And the one in the middle is the one I wanted to draw attention to, is the freedom to fail. In many situations at Google, for example, the senior management has emphasized over and over again that it's okay to try something out even if it doesn't work, for two reasons. First, if you really strive for something, a moonshot, and it doesn't work, you may still achieve something which is less than a moonshot but a lot better than incremental. And the second thing is, if it doesn't work, you might learn something. And I would guess from the earlier talks that we saw that a lot of people who are in the artistic mode try things out that don't work, and they learn from that. If you don't learn from it, then you're the chicken running around with the head cut off.
Yeah, Google sounds like a really great company. Actually, it's a little bit different in Bell Labs. I really like we have the freedom to try new idea, and that's really cool. Like, they give you a problem, and you just can take different paths to solve it, and you can try whatever you want. That's really great. But as in large company, you are evaluated on your results. So maybe sometimes you fear failure, you know, because if you fail, it's like not a good, it's not a positive sign for your career. It's like, no, you failed, so now I won't give you more problems. So I think both are linked together, and if you have the freedom, but you fear failure, you won't do nothing because you're too scared to try it. So yeah, I think these two points are important and need to be linked together.
So there's one other point on the right-hand side of the slide about resources, and this is very important. Even if you have wonderful ideas, if there aren't adequate resources to explore them, then it doesn't go anywhere. I have a good example of this. We recently hired Ray Kurzweil to come to Google. Ray has written a book called The Singularity is Near. He's written some other books, most recently, How to Create a Mind. It's a very, very interesting exploration into how he believes the brain works. And the reason he's at Google is because there is adequate computing and memory capacity for him to try things out, in particular a 500 million node knowledge graph, which is about semantics. There wasn't any place else for him to go that had the scale that would allow this kind of experimentation to be done. So resources really do count.
But again, maybe just giving resources is not enough. So what we have to, I believe we have to do is to do both. Bringing people together and give them resources. And it is what we try to do in our respective company. Here I've put some example of the creative lab in Ballets, which is a room with a lot of color, a lot of toy. You have some robot walking around, you have some video game, and you can really feel as it's a huge playground. And you feel like you can try anything, and you won't have any negative consequences, you know. And you can really be more creative. I think you're doing quite similar experience in Google.
Yes. Well, at Google and at Pixar, although I never worked at Pixar, Google looks like a daycare center. You know, there's all these primary colors, and there are big rubber balls on the floor, and there are billiard tables, and there are micro kitchens. The rule there is that no engineer should be more than 50 meters away from food and coffee or some other stimulant. And so we have a lot of these little micro kitchens everywhere. The idea is to provide places where people would encounter each other on a casual basis and maybe have conversations. Steve Jobs, after the success of the first Pixar movies, Toy Story, had sufficient resources to design a new building for the Pixar team. And he worked very hard on the design with the architects. And the one thing he wanted to make sure of is that there would be a high probability of chance encounters among the employees. And second, unlike most movie production studios, which will assign a team to do the movie and then hide them, isolate them from each other so no one knows what is going on in the other movie developments, he wanted everyone to have access to everything, because he wanted to be able to draw on the expertise of anyone in that building to solve a particular problem coming up. So the key decision that he made in order to improve the probability of these chance encounters was to put all of the toilets in the center of the building, because he knew everyone would go there at least once or twice a day. Now, they probably wouldn't interact much on the way in, but maybe on the way back out, there could be these chance encounters. And it was a conscious decision on his part to increase the probability of this sort of interaction.
So we thought, so the conclusion is bringing people together with resources can increase the creativity. But we also want to speak about the limits of maybe this social aspect of creativity. For example, this morning, Martin Cooper said one of the next revolution will be in social network, you know, by connecting people through a huge database. But I'm wondering, what's the limit of this, you know? Because if we have this huge amount of data, is that not just noise? You know, how can you differentiate the real signal? In optical communication, we have, you know, like the signal carrying data, and then we have noise all around, and you have to filter out this signal. And how can you do the same with this huge amount of data?
That's exactly right. All of my experience has been that small groups work very, very well together. You don't have to spend a huge amount of time bringing everybody up to speed with what everyone else has been doing if it's a small group. So at Google, and certainly all the other experiences I've had, the optimum team size tends to be somewhere between 4, 6, 7, something like that, less than 10, and for really intense work. And sometimes it's just 2. That's one point. And the other one, I love your point about heterogeneous communities. We use this term multidisciplinary, and I hate it. And the reason I don't like it is I don't like the term discipline. And the reason I don't like that is it's an artifact of university structure to manage people. That's why we create departments, but it's all nonsense. All of this is a tremendous continuum. There's abstraction going on, so I'm willing to accept the theory that chemistry is an abstraction of physics, and biology is an abstraction of chemistry, and psychology is an abstraction of biology, and so on. I can accept that as a model, but that doesn't drive you into departments or anything. So there's a university in India called IIIT. It's not the Indian Institute of Technology, it's the Indian Information Technology Institute or something like that. They don't have any departments. What they have is colleges studying particular problems, and they draw on all kinds of resources to do that. So I think you were exactly right.
Yes, that's, we heard also a little, some kind of similar example this morning with Dario Braga that says that students are in a box. You have the chemistry box, the physics box, the economic one. And if you want the student to be creative, you need to make this box communicate between each other. And that's very important to me, to bring people with different background, not just, for example, if we have a scientific problem, not just physicists, because we all have the same point of view on the problem. We know how we want to solve it. But if you bring an artist or maybe an economist, it will have a different point of view. And there's all these different backgrounds that can give a more larger solution, you know, with a deeper understanding of the big picture.
And that, I think, is everything we're going to take time on, because we've already gone over 10 minutes and we have 5 more sessions. So we will stop, and we're eager to hear what happens in the rest of the conversation.
Thank you very much. Thanks again, Vint and Guillem, but we were going to take this chance if there's a question from the floor. Please, Akansha.
In the social aspects of creativity, there's going to be peer pressure. How do people who face resistance or stand out, how do they face that, or still have the courage to bring their new ideas to the floor? Because that's the way creative or disruptions always face that kind of resistance.
Yeah, let me make sure I've understood. Are you saying that the social structure creates peer pressure, and that, but what the consequences of peer pressure are kind of interesting. I know it forced me to finish my PhD. I was going to give up, and then I realized I told everybody I was going to do that, and it would have been too embarrassing not to finish. There are peer pressure situations that you have to fight, especially if the peers are thinking of conventional design, and you're trying to do something different. It's a big issue, and that's why smaller groups are better, because that means you have a fewer number of people to convince that you should go ahead and do it your way.
I was going to add that there needs to be some component of leadership in the, in the person who is innovative to convince the people around them of what they're doing and create that group if they don't have that group.
If you don't mind, let me tell you, I think the most successful engineers are great salesmen, because they have to sell other people on the idea that they want to have happen, that they want to do too. Every single really successful engineer is a great salesman. Go ahead.
Just to add one comment, also the plays that you saw, you know, like in the Google Kitchen or this creative lab, are really good plays because you don't feel this pressure. You know, it's like you just be here with some people to be creative, you know, to get new ideas, and you don't have pressure coming from your management or from your peers and so on. So that's also why it exists, this kind of places inside the company.
Excellent job for this creative dialogue. So now we move on to the first presentation in the session, which is by a sociologist, Stoyan Sgourev. He has a PhD at Stanford in sociology, postdoc at MIT, and is now a full professor at ESSEC Business School in Paris. And whenever you're ready, you're going to take the podium or stay from there? Okay, anyway, he published papers on opera, evolution, and economic history, and all other aspects not prohibited by law. That's what he wrote in his CV. So the floor is yours, Stuart.
Great. Well, thanks a lot. Just very quickly, a couple of references to what you guys just mentioned. The risk of failure is indeed something that for me is a very important predicament to creativity. And just to mention that my office at my school is just right next to the restroom. And you know, this is a great structural advantage because you run into people all the time. And they always pose a question like, how are you? How are you doing? How's the research? Tell me quickly about it. And I get a lot of ideas, actually, just because of this. And when my office was recently moved, and I realized that I missed this. You know, I missed the fact that I was so close to the restroom and all this, you know, the instant feedback that I got from my colleagues. So this is actually, I think I messed this one up because I was supposed to mention two things. First of all, the risk of failure, and the second of all, the closeness to the restroom. So the risk of failure was actually the fact that what you're going to see now is something that I decided to do after I got tenure. So, okay, so I was promoted to full professor, and then you probably know the stage in your career when you're like, okay, I want to do something really sexy. I want to do something that is like, has no chance of getting published, but I really care about it. You know, that I want to explore, I want to play with this. And this is the product of, this paper is actually the product of just this kind of sentiment of, I want to explore. And I'll begin by asking you, can you decipher the title of my presentation. So just by looking at it, what's the title of my presentation? Have a guess.
Well, it starts out with a gorgon of some kind.
Okay, so what is it about? So essentially the first one is what? It's creativity. The second one is what? Social networks. The second one is social networks. The third one? Ballet. And the fourth one? And a billiard table. So exactly, good. That was pretty quick. It was actually 10 seconds. That's a good audience. That's a smart audience. So creativity, social networks, ballet, and a billiard table. And hopefully there will be a link between those four. Now, very quickly about the sociological approach or the structural approach to creativity. What we guys do is quite different from what was discussed on the first panel. We don't really care much about the individual. What we look at is networks, relationships. We're particularly interested in the position of actors in those networks, the flow of ideas. Essentially, for us, the individual is more or less a vehicle through which ideas flow. So for us, networks are very important, but a little bit later on, I'll say why networks are not sufficient and why it's time for us to move beyond the network. Some of the assumptions in this line of research are, first of all, that creativity and innovation develop at the interstices of social worlds through recombination and mixing, that creative ideas emerge from intersections of social relational flows within a multiple network architecture, that creativity is essentially forced by changes in the structure of communities. It is not really individuals that produce ideas, it is the flow of networks through individuals. Novelty emerges through spillovers across multiple intertwined networks through the dynamic feedback among different social networks, okay? Now, this is what we can call the macro level or structural approach to creativity and innovation. At the same time, there's also quite a bit of research at the micro level, at the more individual level. And in the micro tradition, structure provides idea-conducive conditions that are harnessed by brokers. Opportunities or good ideas flow to those people that mediate between disconnected groups and transfer resources between them. This is what we understand by a broker or a gatekeeper. But, of course, there's a very important conceptual problem here. If the natural predisposition of brokers is to maximize control over the network, while motivation and collective creativity are accelerated by diffuse control and by the free circulation of ideas, how can these perspectives be reconciled into a multi-level approach? And this is something that it's not just me, there are quite a few of us, including Simone Ferriani, Maria Chiara Colucci, Gino Cattani, that are basically we're building towards this kind of model, multi-level model, of creativity and creative action. So the proposition that I'm advancing, it's kind of, this already exists in the sociological literature, but has not really been fleshed out, is that individual brokerage may generate processes that are partly unintended and that have global versus just local implications. With the establishment of ties between previously disconnected actors and the generation of social momentum, a broker can assume the role of a catalyst of creativity without an explicit intent. Now, this role of a catalyst, the broker as a catalyst, to my mind, it has two dimensions. The first one is the purely structural dimension, and the second dimension is more social psychological. This is the motivational dimension. So the first one, the structure is where the broker serves as a conduit for the concatenation of previously disconnected networks, creating new sets of relations or rewiring existing ones. The psychological dimension is where the broker serves as a role model, motivating others to take greater risks than typically taken, or to put in another way, reducing the costs of experimentation. And you referred to this as well. Systematically reducing the costs of experimentation. And for me, this is something very important when you look at radical innovation, when you look at radical novelty, which is very, very risky in the very beginning, and investment in those kind of radical ideas early on is not it's not very promising. So the behavioral assumptions that are being made here is that the benefits of social relations need not be strategically pursued, that creativity is lying at the nexus of individuals and the larger social cultural field, that creativity is the cause of spin-off outcome effects at different levels of analysis, and that brokers can put in play forces going beyond their control that lack strategic plan or direct oversight. Now, I illustrate this proposition with an analysis of the Russian Ballet. I assume that you probably you don't know much about the Russian Ballet, but this is in ballet history, and I would say generally in art, nothing matches the 2 decades of Ballet Russe for the thrilling performances. It led ballet out of classicism and into the modern age. It combined truly the most groundbreaking innovations in dance, choreography, art, design, and costume in its productions. It was a huge cultural phenomenon at the beginning of the 20th century. It stretched the limits of the possible in art, profoundly shaping Western culture in the 20th century. The Ballet Russe were headed by Sergei Diaghilev. I would say this is the Marconi of the arts, of the performing arts. A connoisseur, producer, agent, and artistic visionary. Diaghilev was the first to bring together artists, composers, and choreographers for the purpose of creating avant-garde works for the general public. Now, to give you a sense of what the network looked like, in reality, the network is much more extensive than this. And when I started off this project, I was actually thinking of visually representing, the network in its full extent. But then I realized that, we're talking about, hundreds, probably 300 or 400 people, and for now, I've just, you have this kind of a sample of the network. I'm not quite sure you can see the names, but some of the most prominent composers and performers, ballet dancers, are associated with the Ballet Russe. You have Matisse, you have Miro, Picasso, Chanel, De Chirico, Goncharova, Jean Cocteau, Debussy, and many, many others. So on this slide kind of summarizes what I think is probably the major contribution of Diaghilev is what he achieved on the supply side, so to speak, of the art market, and then in connecting supply and demand. On the supply side, connecting very different fields, very multidisciplinary, so he had ballet, music, design, literature, visual arts. Something unique productions came out of this interaction. And then what is important, where was the catalysis? The catalysis was in that those performances introduced many new ideas, which then fed back into the constitutive fields. And this is, remember in the beginning I mentioned spin-offs and spillovers. These are where the spillovers were. It really pushed modern art. It was a very, very powerful incentive for experimentation in all of these fields. And then the second dimension, which I'll just briefly mention, is in creating an audience for this novelty, for modern art. Because as you can imagine, modern art in the very beginning was not commercially viable. There was no audience for this. So Diaghilev was actually one of the reasons why a lot of these innovations actually survived. Now, the motivational dimension, for me, this is really important. It's a difficult sell to a sociological audience. It's an easier sell to a psychological audience, is that this brokerage had a key psychological dimension in reducing the cost of experimentation at a time when these experiments had very little commercial value. He was universally perceived as a model of daring, motivating artists to take chances in artistic experimentation. Now, very quickly, the conclusions, aggregating developments in different fields, literature, music, and design, the ballet made visible what was so far marginal in the French and Western art market at the time, while the dynamic interaction of very diverse, heterogeneous cultural elements fed back to bolster creativity in these fields. In this understanding, creativity is essentially a product of a dual process. You have a process of brokerage in emergence, of a centralized push. This is where the broker pushes, the centralized push and decentralized pull. So basically it becomes kind of a two-stage process of a centralized push and decentralized pull. Now, in the time that I have left, and I would love to have a bit more, actually if possible, to have a bit more time for questions, I'll very quickly sketch out what I'm currently working on. What you see on this slide is something that was recently in the mass media. This is a map of abstract art. Basically, these are the early pioneers in abstraction. This was actually a part of the exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art on early abstraction. And this is a network analysis of those painters. I think, there are about 100, probably a little bit fewer than 100. And if you're interested, of course, you can find it online. There's quite a lot of information. And this is a map that I profoundly disagree with. This was prepared actually by a professor at Columbia Business School, applying network analysis to creativity, in this particular case, to the idea of emergence of abstract art. In general, I think it's a good idea because it sets innovation and creativity in the right context. The problem, however, is when you start actually really thinking about the creative process and the fact that there were multiple pioneers of creativity, and it's really, for me, it's not based on physical relationship. You know, this is, what you see on the map is based on physical relationship. For me, it's not a physical relationship. For me, actually, what is going on is a much more subtle influence. It's much more a question of exposure. And in this understanding, in what you saw on the previous slide, creativity resides in transfer of ideas between fields and in the recombination of ideas. Social ties allow closeness to the source and exposure to those ideas earlier, but do they predetermine the circles wherein the ideas travel? So I think that creativity results from repositioning, when an idea imported from one context provokes the reconsideration of assumptions or established ways of doing things in another context. And for me, the right metaphor for this is not really the social network. And once again, I'm not denying the relevance of the social network. It is important, but it's not sufficient. For me, it has more to do with the billiard table rather than just the social network. So if you look at this, it's really a question of repositioning when one ball hits another ball. And what changes is not just the relationship between those two balls. What changes is the way that the relationship between those balls and the other balls. You know? And this, for me, is what is important in this case is the sequence of ideas and the sequences of influence. And to kind of summarize this thinking, creativity as repositioning, a famous example, this actually comes from a paper that I published on Cubism. Paul Cézanne repositioned the balls in the early 20th century by introducing reductionist methods of representation that were picked up by Picasso, combined with African art techniques, and radicalized into Cubist experiments. But what is essential is that Picasso made Cézanne more accessible to other artists at the time. He actually translated Cézanne for others at the time, and others reacted not that much to Picasso, they reacted to Cézanne as interpreted by Picasso. And this is precisely what I mean by the repositioning and the billiard ball table, that just a classic network model doesn't capture this quite well. There's this dynamic component that is very difficult to recreate in structural terms. And I think, you know, we should really put more effort in thinking about the sequences of influences and about exposure. Well, thank you. Thanks a lot.
We have time for 2 questions. You have 2 questions or one?
Microphone is coming.
Microphone.
Thank you very much. It strikes me that your broker is a catalyst model, and the centralized push and decentralized pull is exactly what's happened with the iPhone and Google and the development of applications, de-risking hundreds of thousands, millions of people to make applications, Facebook wall, Twitter. It seems to me you could really grab a lot of hard data on growth, applications, to apply that, not just to the Russian Ballet, but also to modern times. Maybe there's something really hard there that you could develop.
Every time I need to turn this thing on. Absolutely. The reality is that I'm much more focused in the arts, and I'm probably need to speak more to engineers and people in the technological fields. But I'm convinced that's why I'm here, because I think there's a lot of overlap in what we do and the methods that we use, and even conceptually, even though we operate at different levels of analysis. And I'm personally very open to collaborating with people from other fields, because I'm pretty convinced that what I'm discussing here, this is generalizable. This is not just the performing arts. This is a very general model, the centralized pull and push. And I just need to, this is a very early stage, and I've started thinking about a book. And this is the next step, basically.
Well, we have the data. We know how many applications are on the App Store. We know the number of users. You have all that there. You could actually show it.
Well, we need to talk.
I seem to recall that when The Rite of Spring debuted in Paris, that there was a riot, and some people found it enormously offensive. So the question I have is, how did we finally get past that to the point where there was actually great demand for that kind of performance in the face of people complaining that this was, you know, just a moral offense?
The Rite of Spring is absolutely this is one of the, for me, one of the key moments in the history of Western civilization in general, and it happens to be 100 years. This is 100 years of the Rite of Spring, 1913. As a matter of fact, I'm actually now, I happen to be working on a paper on the Rite of Spring because it's so non-linear what happens in 1913. 1913 seems to be the year when basically, at least French society warms up to modernism. The importance of the Rite of Spring for me was in the challenge, was in the provocation, and in the fact that it really visualized what up to that point was very much on the margins. For the first time, this became central, frontal. It was the Théâtre Champs-Élysées. So for the first time, it became central. And the reality is that this was, of course, commercially, it was a disaster. There was a lot of resistance against it, and it was not staged until 1919. So 6 years, no stagings at all. But by the way, the Rite of Spring remains, to this day, the ballet with the most reinterpretations. There's a site, somebody did this in England actually, they counted the number of restagings and productions of the Rite of Spring, 250. 250. So this became basically a platform for others to play with. You know, so it really inspired people to experiment. You know, so to this day, this remains very much one of the most motivating performances in the history of art, and consequential.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stoyan, for this wonderful presentation. We move on to the second talk, which is by Simone Ferriani, a colleague of mine in the University of Bologna, working in the management department, and is also honorary professor at the business school at the City University of London, working on social networking and creativity, the origin of breakthrough innovation, and entrepreneurship, and the relations between these three disciplines. So now we are uploading the presentation, which has just been refined at the last moment, and I think we are ready to start. So Simone, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, Giovanni, for the introduction. It's really a pleasure for me to be here. It's the first time that I have an opportunity to present this idea to such a diverse kind of community. So I'm really, really interested in seeing what kind of impact these findings can generate across disciplinary, well, let's not use that word, that was the previous suggestion, I totally agree, so across these kind of communities. So I would like to start by trying to connect and to position my presentation within the conversation that we had just a few minutes ago. And there was this notion that bringing together people is not enough. You need many other ingredients. Among them, you need resources, you need a culture that is that tolerates experimentation, that tolerates failure, all these things, which are absolutely crucial for fostering an environment conducive to ideas and creativity. But there is also another element which was not mentioned in the conversation, and which is actually what I'm trying to investigate in this particular paper and more broadly in the research journal that I started a few years ago. And that can be articulated as follows. In order to have creativity, in order to have good idea, you also need to have people who have the ability to recognize the value of those ideas, and which is not necessarily obvious, because if an idea is truly a distinctive, challenging idea, then what typically happens, and that I've seen that over and over again across domains and fields, is that, of course, it challenges the established ways of doing things, right? It challenges the status quo, and so on the receiving end. On the side of the resource holders who are supposed to evaluate and possibly support this idea, there is kind of a tension, okay? Because if that idea is challenging the system, they are the expression of, okay? They are the representative of that established wisdom oftentimes that idea is trying to challenge, then there is a tension. And that tension really is what I've been interested in. And to give you kind of an anecdotal type of illustration of this dynamic, I have put together a couple of examples that I think resonate quite nicely with everybody here because are well-known examples. And the first example is based on George Akerlof's paper, The Market of Lemons, for which he was eventually awarded a Nobel Prize in economics. Well, when he wrote this paper, George Akerlof was almost 27. And essentially, when he received the Nobel Prize, he gave a lecture, the so-called Nobel lecture, where he kind of recollected the story of the reception of his paper in the scholarly community. And so I took verbatim what he said during that lecture, and here it goes like this. By June 1967, I submitted the paper Lemons to the American Economic Review. I received my first rejection. The editor explained that the review did not publish papers on subject of such triviality. No referee reports were included. The Review of Economic Studies again rejected on the grounds that the review did not publish papers on topics of such triviality. The Journal of Political Economy sent me 2 referee reports that carefully argued as to why I was incorrect. If this paper was correct, then no goods could be traded, an exaggeration of the claims of the paper. Besides, and this was the killer, if this paper was correct, economics would be different. Which I think is very funny. So eventually, the Quarterly Journal of Economics accepted the paper. The second illustration is borrowed from the world of art, and it's based on Robert Frank, the now famed American photographer, who made a breakthrough entry into the world of photography through this book called The Americans, who at that time challenged profoundly the canons of contemporary photography. He was a complete outsider at the time. He was 36. And again, we have a nice account of what happened when he tried to make, to establish bridgehead of credibility in the world of photography, this time provided by Howard Baker, the famed sociologist of culture, American. He kind of recollects in a very stylized way what happens. Essentially, he says the angriest responses to the Americans came from photographers and photography specialists who recognized how profound a challenge Frank's work was to the standards of photographic style, photography rhetoric that were in large part shared even by photographers of very different philosophical postures. Now, what's really interesting is that eventually the way in which Robert Frank gradually established his authority was through the support of a completely different type of community. It was writers, novelists, and critics who helped him break through the status ladder, the prestige ladder of the photographic field, not his peer colleagues. So when I think about this through illustration, but I could go over and over again to describe analogous kind of stories, what I derive are 3 what I call stylized observation. The first observation is that whether novelty can fully flower and attain legitimacy is as much the result of the support of the field for that novelty as the intrinsic feature of the novelty itself. There must be some form of support on the receiving end. The second thing is that novelty often originates at the margin. Not always, okay, but oftentimes it comes from the so-called periphery, the outskirt of a given social system, the margins. And because it comes from the periphery, it tends to face more than average resistance from relevant constituencies in that field. And finally, the third observation, we could see this clearly in both examples, is that different constituencies, what I call audiences, because it's a term that speaks better to the kind of literature I'm coming from, might evaluate the same novel rather differently. Okay, we would see that across different journals or across communities, the kind of reaction that novelty elicits can be dramatically different. So based on this, essentially, I've been exploring 3 themes. The first theme, or so-called umbrella theme, is the legitimation processes, the processes by which the new and unaccepted is rendered valid through the formation of some kind of consensus. Then this notion of the periphery as locus of novelty, and finally the role of social audiency in shaping this legitimacy process. Now, in this particular paper that I'm presenting here, these themes are really part of an agenda that is compounded of several papers across different levels of analysis using different methodologies. This particular paper tackles 2 questions that are related to those themes. First, what role do different social audiences play in shaping the struggle for legitimacy among core and peripheral members of a given field? And I would say more importantly, what kind of mechanism can help peripheral players to break through the prestige hierarchies of cultural fields? Now, because the community is so diverse, I decided to avoid the usual kind of structure that I follow when I present this paper, which is starting from the literature and then based on that literature deriving hypothesis, because the literature is literally specific to the sociological kind of domain I come from, and I think it's also rather boring. So rather than focusing on the literature, I'd rather go straight into the setting and the data, and I would like to show you the evidence that we have generated based on this data to try to see whether those evidence can, in a way, shed light on more general processes that resonate nicely with the work that you've been doing. And so the setting is the Hollywood film industry. It's a very interesting setting to analyze this kind of dynamics for various reasons. First, it's an industry that is strongly characterized by the presence of severe disparities in control of resources, capital, connection. In other words, an industry dominated by an elite, where there's a sharp contrast within a small fraction of players at the top of the prestige ladder and a very large pool of peripheral participants who vie to establish a foothold in the industry is visible and palpable. And in fact, it has been often characterized as an industry that has a kind of a core-periphery split in which you have inner core of actors that tend to be a small world of tightly, I'm borrowing words from published work by Peterson and Anand, tightly knit individuals, whereas the periphery is more open. And so I collected information on all the movies distributed by Hollywood over a 13-year period, and in particular, I collected information on the people who worked in this movie, essentially career histories of the people who were involved in key roles. I couldn't collect information on all the credit lines because that would have scaled up to a level of basically untractability in terms of size and amount of data, but I focused on key roles within the movie industry, and for that role I collected information on the people who perform those roles, namely director, editor, cinematographer, production designer, producer, main actor, main actress, and the production designer. In particular, the most important information, overall this is almost 13,000 people over this 13-year period, it's information about the rewards that these people received during this 13-year period. And the nice thing about this industry is that it allows nicely to clearly distinguish between two key audiences that populate this domain, and that's the audience of peers and the audience of critics, because the organization that bestow awards to these people are clearly organized into communities that are either communities of critics or community of peers, and every year they bestow awards to individuals that they believe have made a cinematic, important cinematic contribution to the industry. And so essentially we collect information on the awards given by all these organizations displayed on the slides over the 13-year period. Every year, each of these organizations reward individuals in those categories, in those classes of specialism, with an award in recognition of excellence. And then the other nice feature of this industry is that you can really recreate the network relatively easily, because you have information on, this is one way I try to convey the technique that we have used, which is fairly intuitive. It's essentially an industry organized around projects. Every film is a project, and in every project there are participants, in other words, the artists who work for that project. It's what is called in network type kind of network analysis parlor, it's called an affiliation structure, where you have individuals organized by project. And that's, for instance, the movie Erin Brockovich, and those are the key people who were involved in 2000 in making Erin Brockovich. And so you can assume that because they were working together for that movie, there is a collaboration between them. That's the social tie, the social kind of connection that we can extract from the project level data. And so by doing this, essentially doing this transformation for every single movie over the year, you end up reconstructing gradually the social structure of the industry, because some of these individuals, of course, also work in other projects, and by working in other projects with new people, they become kind of the interconnectors between the people who are part of this industry. In some occasion, they work repeatedly with the same collaborators. Another occasion, there are newcomers as well as old-timers. And so essentially, by repeating this exercise project after project, you can derive the social structure, the social network of the Hollywood industry. Now, when you have the network, you can easily apply to this big network, year after year, algorithm that you can use in order to identify people who are highly central to this network as opposed to people who are peripheral to this network. So by using this algorithm, essentially, we partition the network into two categories, and I will not go into the details of the optimization algorithm that does this, but essentially it partitions individuals into categories, depending on whether they are closer to the core or closer to the margins of the network. What you get eventually is a dummy variable, okay? 1 or 0, depending if you are a core member or a peripheral member of the community. And then the other thing, of course, is this dependent variable that measures the creative success. We measure creative success or recognition as a function of the awards that these individuals receive. We frame the problem as a discrete choice, kind of statistical problem, where the audience, every organization selects from the large pool of available candidates in a given year those that they believe deserve recognition for their achievement. And so they give an award to an individual. When you distinguish between peers and critics, you have essentially a dummy variable that we call peer audience choice, takes the value of 1 when a profession received an accolade from a peer-based organization, or critic audience choice that takes the value of 1 when the profession receives the accolade from a critics-based organization. And then we also collect information, of course, on many other characteristics that might possibly affect the ability of these people to get recognition and legitimacy within the field. We collected information at the movie level, information at the team level, whether the people they work with are highly successful and highly visible or not, whether the project is highly endowed in terms of budget, the genre of the movie. You can see from these slides that we really control for alternative kind of mechanism that might possibly operate at different level of analysis, the project level, the individual level, the team level, plus fixed effect, the organization, the role, and the year. And then we estimated this model where essentially we try to see whether being in the core as opposed to the periphery make a difference when it comes to increasing your likelihood of getting recognition by the key audience, by the receiving end. And when we estimate this model with all the control, essentially that's what we get. I highlighted the variable of theoretical interest, okay? All the others are controlled, but the variable we are really interested in is the core periphery. And what you get when you estimate the model with the peers, with the community of your peer member, is that the core periphery variable is positive and highly significant, suggesting that core members are more likely than peripheral member, controlling for all the other characteristics, so other things being equal, to receive recognition for their work. In other words, there is indication of a process of stratification, of social stratification that is driven by your position in the social structure of the field, because we are trying to control for all the other characteristics, whether you were previously successful, the money, your team. But then the real interesting insight is probably is not surprising, okay, because it's saying that there is a cumulative kind of advantage going on, something that's very similar to what Merton used to talk about back in the 70s, the Matthew effect. But when you move to different audiences, and different audiences, the underlying assumption, I didn't go into the theory, okay, the literature, but the underlying assumption is that different audiences embody different kind of criteria to single out, okay, candidates that are worthy of esteem or admiration from those who are not. You see that the same variable estimated with a different audience is no longer significant, and it's actually negative, suggesting that there is no longer this bias in favor for core member. Okay, and the interesting thing is that depending on the modeling approach that we choose, we get either a negative non-significant coefficient or a negative significant coefficient, which in a nutshell means that when you summarize these kind of findings, that yes, organization of peers, probably less surprisingly, are more likely to favor those who are members of the core as opposed to those in the periphery. But then when you change your focus to a different type of audience, in this case critics, you get they do not favor core members of the periphery member, and they may actually favor those in the periphery as opposed to those in the core. So what kind of implication can be derived from a finding like this? And that's something that I really would like to throw to the audience in order to get reaction, also coming from different type of theories and literature and stuff. Well, first of all, the interpretation that we give is that when audience of peers have a strong tendency to kind of reproduce the existing social structure, okay? Because as a peer, you essentially, what you observe is this phenomenon that is sometimes being described, and that points also to one of the commentary of peer resistance, okay, to whatever is novel. And so the tendency to be more skeptical, to oppose more ostracism is stronger among peers. When it comes to critics, critics create an opening. They provide enable condition for an actor who was more marginal, who has no recognition, who has no status, who is an outsider. They give him more chances because their criteria are not so strongly embedded in that field in the same way in which the criteria used by the peers are, and so that creates an opening for the peripheral to make an entry into the field. To conclude very briefly, that is the last slide. We believe, by the way, I forgot to mention that this is the joint collective, the result of a collective effort. My co-authors are Gino Cattani, which was mentioned, by the way, also by Stoyan, and Paul Allison from University of Pennsylvania, Paul, and New York University, Gino. So what we think we get here is evidence that when you expose, okay, a novel claim coming from marginal player to a more granular kind of reception space. By granular, we mean a reception space that is composed by constituencies that really have different predisposition, different kind of attitude towards the claim that they are exposed to. Then you may increase the chances and the likelihood for those peripheral claims to emerge and make an impact despite all the self-reinforcing kind of cumulative effect that always tend to favor the existing player, those who have already recognition, of course, and penalizing those who are not. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simone. We have time for one question. Please.
Okay. Sorry, it's a degree in theater, so it you get accustomed to not using the mic. But I wanted to ask if at any point during this process did you consider the impact of critics and ego? Simply because critics are often they want to distinguish themselves by going out of the way to find that thing that's different or to recognize something that somebody else didn't see. And so I'm curious whether or not that could be part of causing that negative correlation, that they're actually purposely not going to the core to find something new, partially to distinguish themselves.
Yes, it's a very good point, actually. Very interesting one, and one that we've been thinking through quite cautiously because it was brought up, by the way, also by the reviewers. Of course, we don't, because this is a large kind of sample study, we don't have fine-grained measure to capture things like the ego of the critics, for instance. And all the information that we have at the level of the organization is really pulled together. It's aggregate. We don't know anything about the specific characteristic of the critics who are members of this organization. We only know that this organization collectively selected a given individual vis-a-vis another one. But there's something else that we could do and that we actually did. We distinguished organization depending on the prestige that this organization have in the community. And so we estimated separate models where we distinguish, for instance, the effect that we get when we use the National Society of Film Critics as opposed to the Boston Society of Film Critics. Why is that? Because National Society of Film Critics is widely regarded as being a society composed by highbrow critics, which in a way capture this idea of being more maybe having stronger ego, being more established or something like that. While the Boston Film Critics tend to be less prestigious critics, less famous, maybe less central to the field of literary or film criticism. And so when we do this, what we get is that that effect of the critics being open to the periphery is much stronger among the Boston Film Critics than it is among the National Society of Film Critics. And actually, what you observe, depending on the model that we estimate, is that the National Society of Film Critics tend to behave much more similarly to the way in which peers behave. So suggesting really that there is much more diversity even within critics community than our kind of original pulling together approach would imply. So I think that's very important, and it's related to, I guess, to your original observation that actually, depending on the characteristic of this association of critics, you might kind of get quite different result. Yeah.
I think that you should apply your theory to women's clothing designers and see what the effect of ego and extremism is on this sort of thing.
Okay, so we move on to the third talk. While we do that, I want to just underline the fact that Marconi himself was at the periphery of his field. He was a self-taught experimenter in electromagnetics and was faced with resistance by physicists all of his life, and even after that. So he was really at the periphery. So Ron Corso coming up, and he comes from the University of Southern Australia. He's program director of industrial design and visual communications, and teaches programs and courses on creativity across disciplines. And he will bring us back to the topic of education, but also on tools, which we haven't touched upon yet. So tools to teach creativity. Ron, please.
Thank you very Is that on? Yeah. Yes. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Is there anyone in the audience from New Zealand? Good. So that means, Giovanni, that I think I get the prize for having come the furthest. And I'd like an Italian suit. Okay. No, it is a pleasure to be here, and very inspiring to hear the range of presentations even so far. We tend to be a bit isolated in Australia, so it's one of those things where it's a long way to go. We think we're doing some good work, but it's nice to be able to share it. As I mentioned before in one of the questions, that we use Facebook in our teaching, and it does horrify some of my colleagues. But the reason that we use it is that the students engage in it. They won't engage in the official Moodle sites of the university traditionally. It's a fact, and I mean across all countries that's a fact. So we figured if you can't beat them, join them. Now I'm just going to start off with a little example from the Facebook page, because quite often I get asked, as probably most academic students, and they ask you what you teach, and when you say, well, I teach creativity, they always have a puzzled look on their face. So, well, what's that? That's sort of to do with art. Usually art gets a prize there. And this is along the lines of what I show them. And it's the first exercise, one of the early exercises that I give my students in my creativity class. I ask them to go home, select their favourite mug or coffee cup, smash it, and make something from it. It's a crackpot theory, indeed it is. The thing is, they universally don't select their favourite cup, all right? And there's probably reasons for that, and I don't disadvantage them or mark them down if that's the case. But what it does represent, it's a simple exercise, but not a simplistic exercise. It is a very simple, and some of you may have seen it. It's not novel, it's not new, it's been done before. And what it is, it's a metaphor for the creative thinking process. That's why I set it. If you're familiar with Jerome Bruner, I think he's still alive. Anyone heard of Jerome Bruner? Yeah, okay, probably the one person through my education that's really inspired me. It's the one thing I can always say I remember back from my teachers' college days. He talks about emphasising underlying principles in education, and we've had some really good presentations this morning on just that. Emphasising the core principles. What in fact do we mean by this? So we set this exercise to try and answer this question in a nutshell in terms of what is the creative process. So I say it's a metaphor for the process because you need to break the existing pattern in order to create something new. And breaking that existing pattern, because we know a mug is a mug. We use it for a particular function. We don't ever think about it in any other way until it's either accidentally broken and then we throw it in the trash, or we intentionally break it. Now, it's getting the students to do this is sometimes problematical. They respond in their comments and feedback that they have great difficulty overcoming that hump of actually breaking it. Some of them wrap it up in a cloth and gently break it. Others, let go. Some get told off by their mothers for breaking, the crockery, etc. But there is this mental block in terms of, the notion that you actually break something. But metaphorically, that's what you need to do in terms of getting new ideas. You need to break the existing pattern, then to rearrange it, then to create new patterns, okay? And you can't predetermine these. See, sometimes the students initially have difficulty. They say, well, what am I going to make? Will I make an elephant? Will I make a motor car out of it? And as Judy pointed out this morning, you know it when you see it. Okay, and that's really difficult for students to get their head around, to come to that realisation. You know it when you see it, because we're so conditioned to knowing the right answers, following the rules, following the steps. So it requires observation. You need to look at all these bits and say, well, what can we make from it? So observation is very important. Exploring, experimenting. So that's just a little start off. Now I'll get on to the main presentation. Yes, I think that's it. Okay, so my work in teaching creativity has mainly been centred within a school of art and design, where you'd expect people to be creative. We attract probably the top 5% of creative students. So as I said, it's an expectation. But in the last few years, I've been approached by people outside of that discipline, people in marketing and business and commerce, event management, interested in creativity. And creativity is beginning, as we all know, to gain a lot of importance and a lot of airplay, as they say. So we were faced with this problem that I could go in and do a song and dance, motivate the students, which I can do quite well. But then when I'm not there, they seem to flounder. What do they do? So in business and marketing, we come in, we develop strategies for coming up with new business ideas or being innovative or whatever it might be. And so we thought, well, could we develop some form of a tool that people could use? Now, there are problems with this because the implications are, well, you have a set of instructions and you can learn to be creative. Not so, but this is the perception. So if we go on to the next one. Well, creativity has support. Probably there's two statements here might resonate well with some of your experiences. The Australian government has highlighted the central role that creativity plays in education and as the driver of social and economic success. I mean, I think there's been a lot of initiatives in the UK that this is where all this stuff has come from. However, when politicians start talking about this stuff, we've got to be careful because the politics of it always seems to imply that it's, let's just jump on the latest bandwagon. Yes, innovations seems to be the latest catchphrase. Let's get on with it, okay? We've just had an election, as some of you may or may not know. You probably don't because you don't hear any news of Australia. I really haven't. It's actually nice. But we've talked, politicians have talked about Australia being the knowledge nation, the clever country, and all sorts of catchphrases like this. But we've got to be careful that it doesn't develop into a fad. Speaking to a colleague of mine in Belgium who runs workshops on creativity, he said to me, Ron, I'm not getting a lot of work lately, and I contacted my agent, and he responded that, business people are now saying, oh, this creativity thing, innovation, maybe it's a bit of a fad. So we've got to be really careful. I think a lot of the work that's been done at this conference is to really make that link, to see the real importance of this stuff, not just at a superficial level. So there's a real danger. But in any case, we do have government support, so we try and work with that as much as we can. The acquisition of the cognitive and creative skills required for critical thinking and solving problems are also identified through the Australian Qualifications Framework. Now, this is the body that actually endorses all university programs. We've got to comply with this, or else we don't get accredited. So they're saying that creativity is important. So that's a good sign. Next one. And, you know, I suppose it's the same as most overseas institutions. Australian higher education institutions and academics, you know, recognise the value of creativity in the curriculum, and identify creative student outcomes explicitly or indirectly through their statements and course objectives. Everyone says they're doing it. However, there seems to be little evidence that there are specific approaches to make this happen. So there's a gap between, you know, people saying they're doing it, and I think that was mentioned in some of your work, and it actually happening, or then being able to sort of measure it and say, well, how do we know that it's actually happening and what's actually being done? Interestingly enough, I'm doing some work at the moment with a professor in marketing, and he came up to me after a university seminar. I said, look, I'm interested in your work. I teach a course called Creative Marketing, but I don't do anything creative. But I figured it was a nice term to use. So that's indicative of the sort of language that's being used, but it's not being followed up by practice. So I'm now working with him to develop some strategies, and part of this online tool is being trialled through that work. Okay, we're going to the next one. And again, you know, preliminary review of literature has identified several factors that contribute to this apparent incongruity between the acknowledged need to embed creative skills in the curriculum and the actual practice. And these factors include the following. And again, it's interesting how the same themes keep coming up. An emphasis on knowledge acquisition and retention at the expense of fostering more generic skills such as creativity. The Robinson report was mentioned, and Robinson is interesting because he says not only do schools and education not encourage or foster creativity, they actively inhibit it. Now that's a fairly powerful statement. So as an educator, there's a challenge, certainly for me and I think for other people, because if that's true, if you accept that, it says not only do they not encourage it, but they actively discourage it. Practices actually discourage it. Other factors, an intolerance to ambiguity arising from the perception of academics that there's no space or time in the curriculum for experimentation. You know, you've got to get on with the real stuff, the serious stuff. This creativity stuff's okay if you happen to have a bit of time on the side. It's usually in the school curriculum, it's relegated to that sort of, you know, extra sort of stuff you do when you get through the important stuff. You notice that most art and design classes don't happen in the morning. That's when you do all your numeracy and literacy whilst your brain's still fresh, and then, you know, a bit of relaxation time, the soft option or those sorts of things. There's also a lack of definition, and this has come up. I overheard someone this morning say we should be having a discussion about what we mean by creativity. That's interesting because we could probably all answer that question and maybe come up with something slightly different. We've seen lots of variations already. But it is a problem, this problem of definition and understanding of what it actually is. And this notion that it's this innate ability. You know, you're either born creative or you're not. It's something that you have. And if you haven't got it, that's stiff. Well, that's an Australian term for bad luck because you won't get it. And that it can't be taught, okay? Or that it's arts related. Or it fits into that special talent category. You know, you have to be specially talented to be creative. And, you know, a mere mortal cannot aspire to that. And also the lack of explicit guidelines to scaffold academics in the strategies that enable them to embed creativity in the curriculum. Okay, so there just isn't anything, there's very little, as we've already heard, that actually guides academics in how you do this stuff, even though everyone accepts that it's important. Now, some of the challenges in creating the tool, and some of the features of the process that we wanted the students to experience, and this is what we tried to incorporate into this. Okay, overcoming emotional blocks, the fear of making mistakes. And from my experience, this is the biggest impediment to creativity, the fear of making mistakes. And we are risk averse. We will do anything to avoid giving the wrong answer. In school, you know, you only put your hand up when you know what the right answer is. And you soon learn that if you give the wrong answer, certainly in my case, well, I go back a while in my education, but, you know, we were actually belted, hit for giving the wrong answer. I think those nuns have got lots to answer for. And the challenge, you know, challenging traditions and accepting failure as an important part of the process, which again is a theme that has come up and I imagine will keep coming up. You know, the notion of, you know, could we invest in failure? Is that something that we could do? Etc. Another challenge is enabling our students to make perception shifts and build new relationships. Again, this is a theme that's come up in the way that information is viewed and processed. My definition of creativity that I discuss with my students is that hopefully through their experience in what I provide for them, they will develop the ability to make a perception shift. It's as simple as that. You know, it probably captures all sorts of other more detailed definitions, but the ability to make a perception shift in terms of how you view your world and how you view information and how you process information. That to me sort of is the essence. That's the sort of Brunerism part of this, I suppose. Okay. Fostering conversations and collaborations and reflections. Again, we've had discussions on the importance of communication, curiosity and speculative approaches, playful ways of working. You know, I quite often say to my students, when I might give them an exercise, how would you have done this when you were 5 years old? Right? And it's really interesting when you didn't have those inhibitions, you know, when you actually could just do things and try things because maybe you didn't know that, you know, it was wrong not to do it that way. Questioning approaches. Confidence is really important. This stuff begins to work when people develop the confidence that they can do it. You know, being able to approach a situation not knowing what the outcome is going to be, but having the confidence that you can do it. Now that's a big jump. That's a huge jump for some of our students, having the confidence that you can do something even when you don't know what the answer is going to be. Elaboration, challenging assumptions, etc. And then, look, the rest of it is just goes into some of the details of the actual project, which you can read. Unearthing Ideas Online is the Facebook page. If you want to have a look at it, go on and like it, that'd be nice. Make a comment. My students would be most impressed if they thought someone from overseas was commenting, and we do get that. And the tool that we've developed, Ingenium, is available. If you go to the very last slide, Sergio. Okay, yes, that's the site. We won't have time to go into it, but I think maybe I'll surprise you. But go into it, have a look at it. It takes the students through a number of processes. It starts off by looking at big picture scenarios, the sort of stuff we were talking about this morning, working through particular methodologies. There are reflective comments all the way through because we think it's important for students to be able to think about their thinking. You know, the thinking about the thinking is a really important component of the process. And then hopefully developing ideas, and it's aimed at people that maybe don't have that formal training in creativity. So it's aimed at anybody being able to open it up, have an issue and go through the processes, use the Facebook page to share ideas and see what happens. Work in progress, still being developed, but very exciting stuff. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ron. We have time for one question. Please. Microphone over here.
Thank you. The breaking of the cup is a direct result of Sid Barnes in his Creative Problem Solving Institute, and the other tool that he used was in the next 60 seconds, list the good things that happen as a result of a 747 crashing. If you remember that.
Exactly, yes. And again, it's the unexpected, okay, that we don't tend to embrace. We avoid it. Okay, so you say the positives of a jet crashing or some catastrophe.
Yeah.
Yes,
Well,
very much so.
Sid always said that the finding the solution was starting by making a mess.
Exactly, yeah, or redefining what it is that you're looking at. Yeah, very much so. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
Okay, now the next speech is by Karen Milner. She's a professor at the University of Witwatersrand and in Johannesburg. So representing Africa. Since we said we have 5 continents, you are representing Africa.
Okay, is that clear? Thanks. Thank you, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure for me to be here this afternoon. As I was listening to the earlier speakers, and particularly to the introduction, I was very quickly rewriting my speech in my head so I could incorporate all the ideas. I'm not that creative, I'm not that quick, so I didn't succeed in doing so. But hopefully the resonances that I saw between the ideas of the papers we heard already, the introductory talks, and what I have to present will come through. If it doesn't, please come and talk to me afterwards. I'm really excited here to present what I think is a new and exciting concept and some of the research that we've just started doing on the concept. I'm going to talk you through an innovation platform and innovation idea called UXI, which stands for the Aalto Camp for Societal Innovation. I'm going to start really with a very brief background to the camp. The idea started in Finland a few years ago. Then I'm going to describe a camp that was held in Johannesburg last year and the results of some research I undertook on participants' experiences of that camp, which resonate very well with the earlier comments that we had. Presenters were asked to go easy on theory, so I've left most of the theory out. But for those interested, I was looking at ways in which the participants' experiences mapped onto some of the principles of self-renewing systems and self-organizing systems as identified or as described by Pierre Style, who helped design the camps. I'm happy to talk about this outside of the presentation. And now briefly, just the background to the UXI concept. Okay. So UXI is the camp idea. It started by Aalto University and a group of people called the New Club of Paris. I'm going to share a very brief anecdote about where it came from. A group from the New Club of Paris met, I think, in one of the Scandinavian countries over an informal dinner. And I'm not quite sure, I wasn't there, I'm not quite sure how the conversation moved around to talking about the fact that the only camps that seem to exist in today's world are camps for terrorists, camps to spread ideas of terror, camps to spread ideas of violence, camps to spread ideas of hatred. And somebody in the conversation came up with the idea, why don't we have a camp for societal innovation? Why don't we have camps that spread ideas of creativity, that spread ideas of innovation? There was one of the advantages of this in terms of rapid prototyping and moving things quickly and resources is that one of the people at the dinner was a high-ranking official in the Finnish government who managed very quickly to get the idea into motion, to get some funding, and to institute the idea of a camp for societal innovation. The primary aim of the camp, as it suggests there, is to provide a platform, a global platform for societal innovation, brings together a range of experts from different disciplines, from different cultures, from different age groups, and I'll talk about that as key in a moment, to co-create innovative solutions to what we regard as key problems, societal problems that are facing communities globally. Just to go a little bit more detail into what we mean by a societal innovation camp, very similar, I've drawn these ideas from descriptions of societal innovation labs. The idea is really, it's a generic term, it describes a new form of network. Diverse actors and players from very different groupings come together. The first UXI was held in Finland in 2010. And I'll just let you read what the actual idea of the AXI was. I'll come back to if you need to. The first one was held in Finland in 2010. And South Africans were invited to this camp for societal innovation and recognized how these principles that I've got up there really resonated to address some of the deep, deep social problems that we're facing globally, but specifically in South Africa today, in trying to address the legacy of apartheid, in trying to address the problems of poverty that we're facing, unemployment, and deep social problems which are relevant to South Africa, but also have broader relevance globally as well. And so we saw how these principles could be relevant to South Africa, and we were the first country to take the ideas of a camp for societal innovation out of the Finnish Scandinavian area and moving into Africa and into South Africa. The way a camp works is that a case holder is invited, or people are invited to provide cases or to provide challenges. They're real life challenges. They're challenges that the case holder is committed to fixing, is a real life challenge. They are invited to present this challenge at the camp, and then the camp invites a broad range of people from across different countries, nationalities, ages, races, cultures, expertise, multidisciplines, and brings them together into a 3 to 4 day experience to work together to co-create what we call prototype solutions or prototype ideas. I think solutions is maybe too early, but prototype ideas for addressing the challenges that we're being faced with. That's how the camp works. It's always been based at a university and really allows for a range of stakeholders to work with the university. So it allows business, university, government, communities to operate and to work together to co-create the solutions to these problems. And it's meant to be a protected dialogue space, and I'll come back to that, to work on the kind of principles that we've been talking about quite a lot this morning and this afternoon, to look at creating these maybe out-of-the-box solutions, although somebody said we really just try and make the box a little bit bigger, if not necessarily go out of it. The case participants form groups of approximately 10 people. They work on the cases separately. What's very important is the principles of self-organization are embedded in the design of the camp. So the groups are expected to self-organize. There is a facilitator there because perfect self-organization we found doesn't happen, but the groups are expected to self-organize around solving the problem. And then we introduced the notion of bringing the arts as a specific form of creativity that can contribute something to generating innovative solutions to societal problems. And so we have a facilitator from the arts. In the case of the South African AXI, it was a dancer who came in and facilitated at various points when the group got stuck to create a different kind of energy to the group. And as I discovered from the findings of the research, was absolutely key to the success of the project. Okay, sorry, my cases, I've got case 2 and case 1. I just got the slides upside down, my apologies. But these were the cases that we dealt with at the camp. I'm not going to go into very much detail on them. The first one was trying to address the health inequalities in South Africa. Particular South Africa, like much of the Western world, is developing a tremendous problem with obesity, lack of physical activity. It used to be just a first world problem. It's become a third world problem. And it was trying to look at the built environment, particularly in the inner city, in poverty-stricken environments which are experiencing similar problems of obesity as first world countries, how to address and how to utilize the built environment within the inner city to address issues of obesity in South Africa, so obesity and lack of physical activity in South Africa. And that case was provided by one of the main health insurers in South Africa called Discovery Health. Sorry, that's this case, my apologies, I'll go one back. The other case was the new academics in South Africa. That's particular to South Africa, but what we've got in South Africa is due to the legacy of apartheid, we have a great problem of aging white academics in South Africa. So we've got a very high proportion of senior, older professors and academics who are predominantly white and male. We've got quite a big group of young, up-and-coming, some black, some white academics, and we've got a massive, massive gap in the middle, and it's creating a great crisis in South African education, is how to develop a new generation academics to take up this gap that's occurring between the young academics coming through and the older academics who are retiring. So that case was provided by the university, by the Transformation Office at the university. And what we did was after the period of 3 days, some prototype solutions, which I'm not going to go into now, but some prototype solutions were developed. The one idea was to build a community-based park, which would be supported and built by the community in a very deprived area in Johannesburg called Joburg Park, which would act as a sustainable environment for people and kids and adults to exercise, to learn about health and to address some of the problems of obesity in South Africa. And the second area in terms of the new generations was really to look at a school of diversity to be key to the university, as well as one of the things, and I'll talk about this, it didn't go down that well as a solution, but really to challenge the current university rankings, which rank universities on research output and on various other criteria, but don't necessarily rank universities on societal transformation, on impact, on contribution. So that was something that the group came up with. Okay, I haven't got time to go into the pictures, but those were some of the kind of activities that were going on in the camp. The only one that's really relevant is the top left one, which is an example of the artist facilitator intervening in the group, coming and bringing some energy into the group and working metaphorically with the group in addressing the problems that had been identified. So that's the background, and that's what I hope I managed to get a bit of a sense across of what this Camp for Societal Innovation is. The aim of my research was to explore the participants' experiences who had been through this camp and what it could tell us about the process of creativity and the process of innovation. I was hoping to analyze and identify the key processes that underpin innovation. I was less successful in that, but I'll talk about that in a moment. And really to start document this process, which I think has tremendous application and benefit. The methodology was qualitative. The main source of data was an in-depth review of the lab that people were asked to fill in and to comment on. I also did some in-depth interviews with the case holders and with the originators of the lab, and one of the lab participants also did quite an extensive blog on his experiences of the lab, and I used that as a data source as well for his experiences. And then I just identified the themes using thematic content analysis. Those are just some of the questions that we asked for people to have a look at how they could give them some cues as to how to depict their experiences during the lab. So those were the questions we asked. And these are the key themes that emerged. The first theme was the idea of the lab space as a foreign but safe space, the lab or the camp as a foreign but safe space in which to innovate. And really, for me, what this is, that this theme speaks to a process of innovation. There were many foreigners, and I use the term intentionally, in the group. For a South African group, there were many, many people who were from outside of South Africa, who didn't speak English as a first language, who were culturally extremely diverse, not just within the context of South Africa, which is a very diverse context, but brought in a whole new level of cultural diversity that we had never experienced before. And for many of the participants, this, in the sense of self-organization, took the group to the edge of chaos. There was tremendous frustrations, and I think that that was part of the creative process. There were the starting point of the groups was an enormous amount of frustration and constant iterations of trying to understand and communicate with one another at the level of a kind of cross-cultural complexity. So the starting point was this idea of foreigners and a foreign space, and moving from that through the process of the lab, into a really safe space, which was partly due to the skill of the facilitator and partly, I think, due to some of the processes that we instituted. And an earlier question was raised, if you just bring people together, will you get innovation? And I think that that to some extent answered it. We did bring this not answers it, but give some suggestions. We did bring this very diverse group of people together. Where the foreignness remained, innovation did not occur. Where the foreignness was overcome and a safe and trusting space could be created through the foreignness, we found much more interesting solutions emerging. 2 minutes, okay. The second was the innovation space as a tough, rigorous and demanding environment. And a lot of people have spoken about this before. It was counterintuitive for the participants. They expected it to be a very, very touchy-feely process. They came in again, thought that it would be wonderful. They'd get together in a big group. They'd do some nice touchy-feely exercise, maybe break some mugs, and innovation would emerge. And what they found was an enormous amount of discipline was required. It was extremely hard work. I think somebody earlier mentioned conscientiousness, ego strength. All of those were incredibly important to the work of the lab, was how rigorous and disciplined a process it was. The third and quite disappointing theme for me was there was a large amount of uncertainty around the incidents that led to the breakthroughs where they experienced them in creativity. That's really what I was looking for. I was looking for them to be able to articulate. Just before we got this breakthrough, this event happened. For the most part, that remained a black box, certainly for the participants. The kind of points of bifurcation were not able to be identified by most of the participants. One of the participants mentioned that one of the breakthrough events was moving from a macro perspective, this idea that they had to solve the problems of the world, down to the level of co-creation. If we start with, that was the built environment group, if we start with one person in a park, build it up, we can move from a micro to a macro level, and suddenly the ideas started being generated. But she was the only person who was able to articulate anything. But key to this as well was a break, rather than a make incident, was a break incident. And that was, as part of the process, we invited one of the vice-chancellors of the university to listen to the ideas generated by the new academic group. It was early in the process, the prototypes were not fully developed, and he was highly, highly critical, I think somewhat defensive, of the ideas that they generated, and almost everybody in the group spoke about what an absolute killer of creativity that had been. Out of time. Okay, last one. The last theme that emerged was the lab space as personally transformative. I think I had it written down, but I haven't got it anymore. It speaks to the front of the folder for this MIC conference. I haven't got it. I don't know if anyone's got their folder in front of you, but there's something about creativity. I don't know if someone's got it in front of you and could just yell it out for me. Thank you. So creative thinking is necessary to the dignity of human beings. What we found was a remarkably transformative process occurring amongst individuals of having just gone through these 3 days of thinking innovatively. Most of the people were not from creative or innovative fields, but they found this process completely transformative. And we partly attribute that to the role of this facilitator, this artist facilitator, this choreographer, who managed to generate real communication and difficult conversations within South Africa, which led to people feeling that being in the space was personally transformative. So briefly, the camp succeeded in creating a unique valued experience for participants. We identified the facilitator's skill in managing self-organization as key to the success. I know the phrase multidisciplinarity is an ugly one, but really true diversity in its fullest sense is absolutely essential. The role of the artist facilitator, bringing in the arts to make these transformative shifts, and then our problem that we had, which I haven't got time to go into, which is then transforming these into end products and getting the resources and the buy-in to transform our prototype solutions into real societal change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. Sorry for rushing you a little bit, but we were running out of time. Is there any question from the floor? If not, we thank you again. And we move to the last presentation in the session by Eugene Subotsky, coming up, on social creativity in primary school children. Dr. Subotsky is an American figure in developmental psychology. Wait a second. In the United Kingdom. And he taught psychology in Russia and UK, performed research in Russia, Germany, UK, and Mexico, so he's been around the world.
Good afternoon. The first author on this presentation, Dr. Olga Chesnakova from Moscow State University, unfortunately couldn't make it here, so to better or worse, she delegated the whole presentation to me. And the talk is on social creativity in primary school children. Certainly useful, but is it desirable? Just for the purpose of this study, we assumed that the definition of social creativity is the ability to achieve the person's goals in a communicative situation of conflicting interests. We are manipulating with the key features of the situation and without directly, openly confronting the opponent. This deceptively simple... you want to use this one? Prefer you use this one? I prefer this one, okay. But can you hear me? All right. This definition is deceptively simple because it actually covers a cognitive ability which has a rather complicated structure. And it also has as its precursors such abilities as understanding of theory of mind, the high planning ability, and the high level of inhibitory control. And that's the structure. Let me just skip it because it will take quite a time to read this. Let me just bring you some examples of social creativity. This is socially smart apes that can use social maneuvering to get access to resources while avoiding direct confrontation with the, let's say, alpha male. I wanted to bring you a picture, but it is too obscene. Sorry about that. This is also low-status group members, like immigrants, using creative strategies to overcome the society's prejudices and to filter in up into the higher levels. And this is children manipulating with other people's, mostly parents' feelings and expectations in order to reach their goals without directly confronting the parents. Here you can see a socially creative baby and a socially creative boy who comes from the famous novel by Mark Twain. And in this study, we aim to investigate the ways social creativity is used by school children of various ages and the teachers' attitudes towards social creativity in children. On the basis of definition, we expected the social creativity is useful and adaptive strategy. And it is expected that it will be accepted by the close sort of adult society, which is teachers, as such as useful and adaptive strategy. And we also expect, because it's quite a complicated cognitive skill, we expected that all the children would exhibit higher levels of social creativity than younger children. The novelty of our approach is mostly methodological In previous research, social creativity was studied through questionnaires and psychometric tests, and we designed a real-life situation which put the child in a situation when the child is required to apply social creativity to solve the problem. In the first experiment, we aimed to create a working model of this situation and to examine the kinds of strategies that children actually use in this situation. Participants were a younger group of children, 6 to 8 years old, and an older group of children, 9 to 11 years old, with quite a large number of subjects in each group. And the experimental group included 2 children, a target child, a Confederate child, and their teacher. The task was simple. The target child was asked to hide an object in one of 7 boxes, which were all different colors and shapes, while the Confederate child and the teacher were absent. When they come back, the target child was supposed to convey the message to the Confederate child about the whereabouts of this hidden object, without displaying this, without making it clear to the adult as well. So the adult should stay kind of ignorant of where the object actually is. And this is a situation of the conflict of interests, because the adult is interested to know, the child is interested not to let him or her know, and let's see how the child comes out of this difficult situation. That's how it worked. And here's the results. The younger children displayed mostly unsuccessful strategies, such as deception of the Confederate or direct indication of the object's location to the Confederate, which of course was not an acceptable solution because the adult also get to know where the object is. The older children significantly more often used the appropriate strategies, such as referrals to the past experience, which is shared by the children but not by the adult. For example, the child could say, the object is in the box, the color of the ball we played yesterday, okay? So the children know that they played, for example, a yellow ball yesterday, but the teacher doesn't. And this solves the problem. So in concluding this particular experiment, we can say that according to the expectation, between 6 and 11 years of age, there is a growth in the ability to display social creativity in children. But at the same time, the number of children who escape the situation by declaring it to be unsolvable remains constant. In experiment 2, we aimed to examine teachers' attitudes towards social creativity in children. And the participants were teachers. They were given 4 tasks: to rate the children for social creativity, to assess their own feelings towards children with social creativity, to imagine the ideal class of 30 people and indicating what percentage of social creative children they actually consider to be optimal in this group, and finally rate the positive and negative feelings towards creativity, social creativity in older and younger children. The results indicated, and I'm watching the time, the results indicated that in their ratings, the teachers failed to distinguish children who invented successful social creative solutions. They rather mistook social creativity for deception. But then, after they were explained what social creativity means, they felt more positive towards children's socially creative behavior with other children, and less positive if the same behavior was exhibited towards adults. The teachers also agreed that the proportion of social creative pupils in the class shouldn't exceed 18% average. And the teachers found that in younger children, social creativity is more tolerable than in older children. We can therefore conclude that most teachers don't have a clear idea about social creativity. But when explained what it is, they don't welcome social creativity when it is displayed towards adults. They prefer not to have a large percentage of socially creative children. And they are more willing to accept social creativity in younger pupils than in older children. That's how it works. We actually value social creativity in people, but we prefer not to deal with opponents who are socially creative. That's what the teachers' answers tell us. And to round out the whole talk, I have to conclude that, as expected, social creativity in older children was higher than in younger children, so it increases with age, which is not surprising. What was actually surprising, but it resonates with one of the previous talks about how welcome or not welcome social creativity is. What was surprising, that the teachers are more ready to tolerate social creativity in younger than in older children. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Eugene. Time for one question. Please.
Did you do any analysis on the basis of gender?
No. There were equal proportions of girls and boys in each of the samples, but we didn't do statistical analysis on the basis of gender.
It's an observation and a question. The results feel like an example of, teachers wanting to be in control, and I do appreciate that. In a junior high school class, the kids can drive the whole thing completely berserk. On the other hand, creativity is about letting people get out of control to some extent. So the interesting question for me is, how do we reform our educational system to allow a lot more creativity while somehow maintaining a civilized environment?
It's the same question that basically you asked to Dr. Cooper about how do we reform medical doctors to accept that it's better to have healthy people than sick people. I don't know. I don't have an answer to that question. Sorry.
I think it's an excellent. But it's an excellent question to point to the next session, which is in creativity in education. We will close this session before you.